So picture the scene: you've lost your job, you're dealing with crippling substance addictions, and your wife just left you for another man. Winning in Warhammer 40K is literally all you've got left at this point, so let's talk about winning by any means necessary. Hello and welcome back to Warspec's Tactics, where today it's time to talk about the dark side of Warhammer 40k, with an important guide of how to avoid losing, feeling inferior, or having anyone to play with you in your local gaming group. There's all sorts of problems that Warhammer 40k cheating can solve. First up, it's important to develop the mindset. It probably helps to have something horrendous going on in your personal life to give you the excuses that you need to be sad enough to play unfairly at a game of model soldiers, though otherwise that might take a bit of conscious effort. And you've got to meditate and be focused on what you really want out of life, and that clearly means fleeting victories on the tabletop and the mad rush of secret power that it brings over you. And you've got to be good at letting go of things, letting go of losing, but also letting go of friends, hobby shops and local tournaments, which might not be quite as open to you as before you try all this. Getting straight down to business though, if you're confident that your own abilities don't have what it takes to overcome your opponent on the tabletop, there's plenty of ways that you can basically win the game before the battle has even started on the tabletop. A skilled commander picks their battles carefully, and there's plenty of ways that you can carefully coordinate a matchup so that the odds are very heavily in your favour. In the normal pre-game discussion sort of phase, be sure to use any information as to what armies they collect and what they're bringing along to heavily tailor your forces. It'd be nice to have exactly the right guns to counter every single one of their units and make sure that every exchange of damage is a short and brutal one in your favour. If you're playing against some knights, you want literally nothing but anti-tank weapons. And if you need to orchestrate something like that in the heat of the moment, you can have multiple different army lists planned out, choosing the exact best one that will give you the most chance of victory once you've seen what your opponent's bringing. In 40k, most people will trust you to write a coherent army roster and stick within the limits agreed. Most opponents aren't going to be mistrustful enough that they'll actually add up all the points though, so who's going to know if you take an extra small unit or two? Who's to say if you just didn't include them on the roster but they're still within the points limit, not without adding up every single unit in your force? Writing the list on the back of a crumpled napkin, or just trusting your memory to have it all down, is really going to make it hard to check as well. There's victories that you can win when you're assembling your army as well. Everyone loves a good outside scenic base for their characters, but make sure you don't do what weaker players might do, and make sure your opponent is aware of any discrepancies and modify any ranges for auras and similar. And maybe you can assemble all the miniatures that want to be hiding from the enemy lying down. It's going to be extra hard to draw a line of sight to them then. Proxying can be another tool to confound and confuse your victim. For any special weapons or sergeant upgrades, just say they're somewhere in the squad, no need to mark the exact model. And better yet, you can have multiple different units that look visually the same running around the tabletop, armed with slightly different weapons, so your opponent never knows exactly what they need to shoot. You can help get the game off to a good start by offering to set up the table. You can guide newer players in the appropriate amount of terrain to put on the board. Perhaps you're cracking out your ultimate gun line or tank force army. It only makes sense that you'd be trying to engage the foe on a big open plain with a whole load of desert terrain. Maybe a token ruin in the corner where they might be able to hide one of their units behind, but you don't want more than that, or perhaps a stumpy tree out in the open. If you're playing a melee heavy force though, take the fight to the cities. You want as many ruins on the table as possible, so that no shooting unit can see more than 6 inches in front of its face, and school the opponent a bit about some nightmarish guerrilla warfare tactics. Then when getting things started, you may as well offer to keep the score. If you record the victory points, then you have all the power, particularly if it's done on a phone app where it's not quite as easy for your opponent to see exactly what you've entered for them. Might be a little bit trickier to check the entries and whether or not there's any errors. And if for some reason you should have the unthinkable happen and you reach the end of the game and you're behind on victory points, always possible to go back to previous turns and with a bit of memory of faith just add a few more victory points in here and there, remembering that you scored that objective on one turn. Best to correct any of your scores with some rose-tinted glasses. One of the most important phases of Warhammer 40k is the movement game. Knowing how to position your units well is one of the keys to victory, though if you do happen to have anything slightly out of place or not moving quite as fast as you want it to, it can be kind of hard to push back on people who just move things a little bit further than they should do. Maybe start by giving all of your forces just that extra inch or so worth of movement, see if you're pushed back on, and then get gradually worse until your opponent eventually says something. Another favourite of misdirection could be to measure from the front of the model and then move the models back to the place that you've measured. That can gain you the entire model's base or hull onto your movement tally. Don't worry too much about moving things around the edge of ruins for models with big bases. Kind of makes sense, they'd just be able to smash through anyway, so just allow them to ghost through those bits. And always just have an eye of generosity when measuring your own charge distances. If it's kind of close, then always plump for the distance that's slightly shorter than it could be. When he gets to shooting and inflicting some all-important damage on the enemy, it's nice to be able to tip the odds in your favour, crack out some special dice that you've had concocted for the big rolls, have them weighted so their sixes show up far more than normal, maybe with the help of a little bit of microwave or ovening, or have some nice extra sixes where the ones might be. Who's really going to be checking if every single dice has the right number of spots on it? If you're challenged about this sort of thing, immediately say that you need to use the toilet and be ready to flush them down as soon as you're challenged. That one works every time, and in no way are weighted dice hard to flush. In the shooting phase, terrain is really important. It can be really good for hiding your miniatures behind, but even more so than this, it can be good for hiding your dice. Roll all the dice on your side of the table, preferably behind a great big ruin or something, and then at each interaction, just pick up one more hit or wound than you got. It's all well within the realm of possibility. If you've got multiple profiles on a unit that are trying to attack an enemy, then you may as well just roll the dice before you're deciding exactly which of those profiles you're going for. Then it can be nice to choose after, depending on whether or not you've got a good or bad roll. If your crafty opponent is able to have a good look at the dice that you're rolling, you can still have some fun with the edge cases, re-rolling cocked dice only if you don't like the result. No need to have any sort of consistent policy on that sort of thing. Perhaps the easiest and most impactful way to cheat in 40k though, is to come with the game with rules that work very differently inside your head from the way that Games Workshop have written them. 40k has a massive amount of armies, and most players won't be familiar with the most detailed bits of each one of them, so if you've given up the burden of morals, there's plenty of room for inflating some stats and stratagem abilities every which way. Unusual guns that people don't know the profiles of can gain an extra shot. Fast vehicles can gain a little bit more movement, and misremember the rules so your rerolls are just a little bit more powerful and apply to more things than they should be. Provided every single mistake just happens to be in your favour rather than against you, this can produce the powerful swing in the game that you're no doubt looking for. And every time that you are genuinely uncertain about something, it's important not to check that in the rulebook and just go with the more powerful of the two options that you might think that it could be. If your army happens to have a codex, then it's most important that you keep that to hand all the way back at home on your bookshelf. You want to keep it away from the gaming table, just in case a wily opponent should happen to double check some rules that seem kind of bizarre. As well as forgetting rulebooks, important to forget anything else that won't help you as well. Probably the most important one is the command point tracker. This should only ever be remembered by yourself at the very start of the turn when you need to add on your command point, otherwise just leave it alone. Each time you use a stratagem, proceed directly to doing the effects of that stratagem, and then by the time that's happened, hopefully your opponent will have forgotten all about the cost you might have paid for it. A success should be winding up the game with 10 or more command points in the bank, but having used about 20 stratagems over the course of the battle. Unfortunately, with the complexity of Warhammer 40k, sometimes rules debates do occur. They often have answers buried deep within the designer's commentary, or it might be a close decision as to whether or not something has line of sight or something else similar. The normal way that these rules disputes tend to work is that the bigger, louder, and more physically threatening person will win in this situation, so it's a great time to try and show your dominance. Just make it clear to your opponent that if the rules aren't played your way, literally no one is going to have a good time in this game. But if you should ever have to concede ground with another 5 players from nearby tables stepping in to tell you that you're wrong, make sure that you're murderously sulky for the rest of the game, so your opponent will fear to make the same sort of challenge again. Games Workshop in Warhammer 40k has developed a clever series of traps called gotchas, surprise moves that might be stratagems or datasheet abilities, things that your opponent might not reasonably be able to see coming unless they know your army in and out, and along with the rest, this can be one of your quickest and easiest game-winning paths to victory. At the start of the game, it's very important that you tell your opponent that you're playing by intent, even if you have literally no idea exactly what that phrase means. As far as anyone knows, it's just a buzzword to make your opponent go a little bit easier on you for the first few turns, and make the first few blows on the gotcha game particularly vicious. Several armies might have an unusual datasheet ability, or a powerful stratagem they could employ in a reaction to one of their opponent's moves, so there's a closely guarded secret that must be kept hidden at all costs. If your opponent asks you directly about any abilities that you might have, then feel free to feign ignorance. Just shrug your shoulders and say something about Warhammer 40k having lots of rules. It's important to shoot every angle. Once your trap card is sprung, don't consider any takebacks. It's important that your opponent learns the game of Warhammer 40k in the most brutal and punishing way possible, even if it changes the entire game. Obviously, if you're the first person to fall foul of such an event, just whine and plead your case, and a lot of good-natured opponents might allow you the grace of a takeback. As within the Warhammer 40k setting, any ounce of compassion and mercy is their greatest weakness that you can exploit. The holy grail of gotcha moments is if your opponent accidentally gifts you the entire game by basically skipping one of their phases. Say a newer player moves a couple of units and then goes on to shoot with one of them because they're interested to get onto that bit, forgetting that they have the rest of their army to move. On no account should you allow them to go back and complete their movement phase, even if it basically means that the game is over with all state of functionality at that point. Then if somehow between all that it's still not going your way, any lapse in your opponent's attention or presence at the table can be capitalised on big time. If it needs to nip away to use the toilet or attend to something else that isn't directly relevant to the game, it's a good chance for a bit of crafty repositioning if you think that anything could have its game state improved on the board a little bit. If your opponent has been kind enough to do this while you're doing your movement phase, it means that basically all of your advanced rolls get an automatic 6 when they're needed, and then with any remaining time you can have a bit of a play with the mission deck, read through all the cards and arrange them in an order of your choice. Always very powerful to get some tactical foresight on the tactical missions. Pros at sleight of hand might well be able to do this while their opponent's still in the room if they fancy themselves a bit of a street magician. Nudge a few units around while your opponent's misdirected elsewhere, and have some nice march cards so you know what's coming next. Finally, for an alternative next level play, you can use the sheer crushing weight of time to grind down your opponent's army. Play a force that's going to be optimal for victory around about turn 2, maybe an aggressive melee focused faction that will do super well in the early game, and then play recklessly with them, moving on to all of the objectives. The trick is not to do this too quickly though. Every unit and every model must be meticulously measured out, put back where it was, and its position tweaks, or with a good 2 minutes or so think between doing every single action. Bring around about 5 dice along for the important rolls, even if you need to roll about 30 or so at a time. Question every single one of the opponent's rules interactions, including basic stuff from the core book, and the hours will be flying by before you know it. If you just happen to be out of time midway towards turn 2, I guess you'll just have to tot up the score then, by which time all your units should be in the ascendancy in the middle of the board, with the opponent not having had enough time to shoot them down yet. If you can learn all these clever tricks and put them together all within the same game, you'll have achieved Warhammer cheating transcendency. And as you go on to hit your opponent with each new level of nefariousness, don't forget that if they choose to abandon the game and no longer play, then this is a concession. You have won, and mark yourself down for an 100-0 victory, and you can go on to bask in your own glory. The pathway from there can go in all sorts of different directions. You can go on to attend a big tournament and test out how well all these crafty tricks will work on live stream on the top tables. That's one way to really make a name for yourself. Or you can just stay as a local legend, challenging newbies to games and teach them just how painful Warhammer 40k can be. In any case, hopefully that's been a guide that's useful to some of you. I'm sure there's at least a few people listening who feel like sending themselves to Warhammer hell. In any case, it was fun to make another slightly tongue-in-cheek guide. Maybe on a slightly more serious note for a second. If you happen to be playing people who make some of these mistakes, I'd usually go by the maxim of never ascribing to malice what could easily be explained by simple mistakes. 40k is fairly complicated, and in my experience you're far more likely to run into people who are just playing things wrong unintentionally, as opposed to actively going out and having some sort of Machiavellian plan to win games between hard cheating and shooting every angle. In any case, look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments below. Which of these have you seen out there in the wild before? I feel like I've seen the majority of them myself at least once, though thankfully very few and far between. I feel like the Warhammer community in general is a bit better than perhaps it used to be a good 10 or 20 years ago. In any case, if you enjoyed the slightly daft video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description down below. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.